We can start to settle and get started.
Hey folks. So I'm Justin with Adult Services at the Watauga County Library, and we're very excited to have Ranger Olivia Burke here to do this talk. It's going to be great. I can't wait. So I got a little introduction from her, and I was going to read it out. So Olivia is originally from New England and got her start working with the National Park Service in the Interpretation Division at Cape Cod National Seashore 6 years ago. She fell in love with empowering visitors to learn about the area's natural and cultural history and was inspired to help everyone find a love for the area that has meant so much to her. After completing her degree in history, she worked at several other parks before moving to North Carolina as the volunteer coordinator for Blue Ridge Parkway, and then this year shifted back to interpretation up in the Highlands District. Her talk tonight is called Women in the National Park Service, and she will be returning to our library first on Wednesday, April 10th at 11 a.m. for a guest story time, and the next day, Thursday, April 11th at 5:30 p.m. for another history talk entitled What's in a Name? The Creation of the Blue Ridge Parkway Within the Greater History of the National Park Service. And we have even more programs with Olivia planned this year, so keep an eye out for more announcements as they come. And I'm going to turn it over to Olivia.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. My name is Olivia. I work with Blue Ridge Parkway, and as you can tell, I'm a little bit of a history buff. And I'm super excited to be here with you guys today, and I'm a big public library fan, and so I knew this winter when things quieted down to run over here and join in the lovely events that are here in this library. So as Justin said, I'll be talking about women in the National Park Service today, and most specifically kind of some of the early National Park Rangers who were women, what their roles were like, and then how things changed over time. We'll kind of go chronologically as we go kind of to the present day. I'm super excited for this because as a woman in the Park Service, it's really cool to see how we got from point A to point B. And there's some incredible ladies that we'll talk about today, kind of go into depth with some of their stories. And I think you'll find that there's some incredible ladies who work for them. And so one of you were mentioning there is a lady park ranger in this photo. I don't know if anyone can pick her out, but she is third from the right. Her name is Claire, and we'll talk about her in a second. And so as we go on this presentation, there's a lot of, as I was doing my research, there's a lot of firsts of, first someone to do this, first someone to do this. And I don't want to go too heavily with those because there's a lot of different variations and duties and titles that kind of get clouded with the women who are actually doing the things on the ground. So I'll kind of go a little bit with the firsts, starting with Esther. She was, by all of our calendars and notes, the first lady to be employed by the National Park Service in 1916. Now, if we put our history caps back on, the Park Service was created in 1916. And so she was employed by the Park Service, by Wind Cave specifically, a couple months before the Park Service itself was founded. Wind Cave was an established national park, but the Bureau of the Park Service itself was created a little after she was employed. We don't have a photo of her as a ranger, which bums me out. You'll find as we go, I'm a huge photo lover, especially historic photos, and that's the reason I'm using a PowerPoint. I don't really like PowerPoints, but photos are just so powerful and get me excited. Also, I never mentioned, if you have questions or comments, feel free to just raise your hand and we can chat. Yes?
Where she graduated from? Is that high school, college?
I believe it was college. Well, actually, so the photo, she has a college degree. The photo, I believe, is from high school because she was employed when she was 20 years old.
Where did you go to college?
I don't remember. Some of the other ladies will talk about some of their degrees and things. But yeah, if you have questions at any point, just please let me know, because the more excited you guys get, the more excited I get, and then we just start flying away. Yes?
You mentioned Wind Caves. Where is that?
In the Dakotas. So you got like Badlands, you got Wind Caves. So that's super
Wow, that's hardcore.
Yeah, so, and one thing I want to mention with Esther, and we'll see with some of the women as we go, her brother was a park ranger there, as well as her father was. And so we'll talk a little bit about how these women got their jobs, because some vary, with the location and things. And so with Esther, it's a super remote area. And so not a lot of people were living out there. And so her brother and her father, they needed an extra ranger. She knew the area, she knew the stories, and so she was employed. Her nickname was Shorty, affectionately known as Shorty. And she got about $50 a month with her salary. She worked seasonally, which wasn't horrible pay at the time. I think, God, $50 a month, but yes. We'll talk about a little bit as we go. So her family members were employed by the park. And so as we go, you'll find some of these women rangers were employed because they were family members, because they lived nearby, because of World War I, all of that. So Esther's a great place to start, and she did cave tours, and she became very well known for her tours in the cave. Another woman I want to mention is Claire Marie Hodges. She is one of the more well-known early women park rangers. And again, I love photos, and some of these early photos are truly astounding. And so she was employed by Yosemite National Park. And when she was employed, she was no stranger to the area. She had made a trip there when she was 14 with her family, which when we go to Yosemite, we take a car. It is fairly remote. But at that point, to get into the valley, that was a 4-day horseback ride journey. And at 14, she visited for the first time with her family, and then went there 5 to 6 more times later in her life. About 10 years later, she worked at the Yosemite Valley School as a teacher, and worked there for about 2 years. And then from there, now we're at 1918. And so World War I has happened, and a lot of men who were working as rangers were then drafted into the war. And so she applied for a position as a park ranger in Yosemite. At this point, she knew the area, she knew, the plants, the animals, the history, all of that. And so when she applied, she didn't think they would consider her. But the superintendent of Yosemite at the time mentioned that he was hoping to hire a female ranger, but hadn't found the right one yet. So, and there she was. And so she didn't wear any kind of authorized uniform, as there wasn't an established uniform until 1920. And so a lot of early park ranger photos, whether it's men or women, have very, she's dressed to be out in the elements for days, which she was. She very often would ride through the valley on multiple day journeys, bringing receipts from park headquarters to the entrance station and back. She registered tourists, issued permits, helped people get settled for camping, and she did all sorts of things, from patrolling, stealing firearms, all of that. So she was doing all the duties that any other ranger employed by Yosemite at the time would. And we have her quoted as saying, "Women can do all kinds of things and enter new fields of work if they care to." And there was a superintendent who quoted saying, "Visitors were quite surprised to see a lady ranger with a badge and full riding uniform." And I apologize, I'm reading off. There's a couple quotes I'll be sharing with you during this presentation. And so Claire, and in this image here, this is her admissions letter for her position. Now, it might be hard for some of you to read, so I'll read it out to you. "Dear Mr. Secretary, I have the honor to recommend the appointment issue in favor of Miss Clark Hodges of California as Ranger in Yosemite National Park at $900 per year." Her name is Claire. It's written as Clark. Whether it's a typo intentionally, we'll never know. But it's very cool. You'll see the date at the top, May 13th, 1918. So she was appointed $900 a year and worked seasonally in the summertime. So we talked, our first Lady Ranger, Esther, she was living in the time. Her family members were rangers. And we have Claire here who lived in the area, knew the area, so they're being hired for a couple different reasons. And the next lady ranger I have is Isabel Lawson, and her story is very, very interesting because she did not live in the area, nor was she a family member of anyone working as a park ranger at the time. And so Isabel got her BA from Wesley College and then her master's from Columbia University, and she then taught at Wellesley in 1918, 1919. Now she was offered a job at Yellowstone in 1919 after, this is the coolest story, she was there as a tourist. She was visiting, and she's giving lectures to the group she was with, and the superintendent overhears these lectures and then recruits her to be a ranger because of the skill at disseminating information and her knowledge on geology. And so this is a quote from the superintendent at Yellowstone about Isabella and her impact on him. So he said, last summer she was in Yellowstone Park as a tourist and lectured to the Brooklyn Eagle Party on the physiographic features of the park, particularly the geysers and hot springs. I was amazed by the knowledge of the park that she displayed, but I was even more surprised to find that she has a remarkable faculty of explaining geologic phenomena in popular language. She's a splendid public speaker and has the ability to hold a large audience while discussing scientific problems. He later goes on to write, my idea is to have Miss Bassett, that's her married name, act as a ranger in guiding people about the geyser formations while performing duties relating to the protection of these formations. In the evenings, it is expected that she will lecture to the traveling public. She will also perform service in getting specimens for the museum of the park and getting data for our information bulletins. And so you can tell she was visiting, giving lectures to the group she was with, and the superintendent was like, we want her to work here. And so when this superintendent, reminiscing years back in an interview, he noted about her, he never saw anybody in the years he worked there work as hard as she did. He went on to say that she was very conscientious, very earnest, and a very good speaker. And I'd like to have had her there permanently. So she worked there seasonally and then wound up getting married. And then didn't work for the Park Service anymore, but she wound up being one of the first petroleum engineers and then later a professor. So she was a very skilled, educator and scientist, and it's really cool that a lot of these women, they were related to rangers or they lived in the area, which doesn't discredit, them getting hired on, but she had been kind of recruited from afar to be a ranger at Yellowstone.
So Olivia, did
Yes.
they matter then, whether they were single or married or something? Like a lot of teachers had lost their job and got married. Was that an issue at all with the Park Service?
They preferred single women. Well, there was a lot of difficulties with women regarding things like getting married and housing, because housing in the parks early on was barrack style with all men, and so that kind of threw a wrench into some of these plans if they could even house ladies. But they preferred single women, and a lot of the women, I think a majority of them that I'll talk about, married other park rangers. And then when they married them, usually their career fairly ends there and or shortens. But yes. So the next ladies we'll talk about has a similar story as to how she got her role, but I love the story of it. So this is Frances Pound, and her nickname was Jim. I don't know why or how, but that was her nickname. And so her father was a ranger at Yellowstone. And you'll find a lot of these women worked at Yellowstone or Yosemite or a cave. The superintendent at Yellowstone hired the most women in these early years than any other. So a lot of the women we talk about are from Yellowstone, and we also have a lot of information from that superintendent about them, hence why we're able to kind of learn about them now. And so Frances, also, how cool is she? I've been, admiring all of these ladies. And so she began her Park Service career when she was 19 in 1926. And so her father worked at Yellowstone. And the story at which how she got her job was there was a 3-day meeting with all staff members at Yellowstone, and everyone's meeting in their headquarters building. And so she managed the entrance station. She just covered it while everyone else was in a meeting for a couple days. And later on, the superintendent, he comes up to her and he says, "How would you like to be a park ranger?" And Frances, didn't think it was possible, didn't really think that was an option. And the superintendent replies, "Well, I don't know, you've done such a good job. Do you think you could get a uniform and be ready by June 15th? And she said, "Absolutely." And so she worked as a temporary ranger, which is the term we would use for like a seasonal ranger in the summer times, from 1926 to 1929. And she was noted for 1927, she arrested 3 park employees for bringing alcohol into the park, which was a big no-no at the time. And the superintendent noted that as the most significant arrests of the summer. So her duties were very similar to the other women we've talked about. She was going on patrol, she was managing entrance permits, entrance stations, and you see she's got this kind of long coat on, and at this point there's no women's uniform option. At this point, the men's standard uniform is very, very similar to this. She's just wearing kind of a long coat option, and we'll talk about uniforms a lot, but her uniform was inspired by another park ranger who was there a couple years earlier, Margaret Lindsley. And she is probably my favorite lady who we'll talk about this evening. And I think the reason being is that I have a lot of stories from her, and I wish I had more stories about everyone else. And there's a lot of women park rangers early on who we don't even know their name. Like they were mentioned, oh, there's X number, and we just don't know some of these ladies' names who work there. And so some of them, like Margaret, she was in newspapers a lot. It was kind of a weird phenomenon seeing a lady park ranger. And she also worked in Yellowstone. And so she grew up in the area. She grew up in Mammoth Hot Springs. And so she was an expert in the area. She knew left from rights to this plant to that plant. And one of my favorite stories is that she attended Montana State College for her bachelor's. And then she got her master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. So she goes out east, gets her master's in bacteriology, and starts working at a lab out east. And she supposedly hates it. She quits her job, buys a motorcycle, drives across the country back to Yellowstone, and then works temporarily as a park ranger in the summer seasons. And one thing that's kind of her big first is she was the first permanent park ranger. A lot of these ladies were hired seasonally in the summertime, kind of cover absences from men who were going into World War I. So she worked temporarily, and then she was hired on permanently, and she had all the same duties as all the men. And you can see she's in that kind of longer coat style, and she is known for kind of making that the unofficial ladies' uniform. She changed the cut and style of the men's uniform to fit a woman a little better. And a lot of the ladies that we have seen and will see mimicked that same style and wore that same style coat that kind of became the unofficial uniform.
This might be off the wall, but a couple photos have had horses in them. So I just wondered if that was a requirement, because maybe they didn't have vehicles that could go into the hinterlands.
Yeah, not a requirement such as you have to know how to ride a horse, more like an asset to your job. Okay. These parks were super remote. You're getting from one end to the other. You're doing boundary patrols, things like that. So horseback was the main mode of transportation. You'll see in a couple slides, one of the women is posing next to those carriages that would have taken people into the parks, but horses was a primary mode of transportation and doing the job.
Yeah. And so was it Yellowstone because that superintendent was real supportive of women? Most of them were Yellowstone so far.
That's a good question, and we'll get into it more a little bit, but the superintendent at Yellowstone hired, I believe it was 10 women from 1920 to 1928, which was more than any other did. I have some quotes and things we'll get into with him a little bit. So I won't go any further yet, but we'll come back to it. Yeah.
So out in that park in particular, there's a lot of wildlife. If they're ranging around, do they carry a gun?
Some women did.
Okay.
Some refused to, some did. If I go back, Frances did. She carried a sidearm. And yes, some did, some refused to. Because a lot of early on in the Park Service, you were a ranger. And there was no distinction really between what your role was. It was a lot of doing everything. And we'll see as time goes on, they start to kind of put people into different job roles. But so for most of these women, a lot of them did. And yeah, so with Margaret, she's kind of well known in the press. Not well known, but there were articles written about her. A lot of the photos we have were from newspaper articles and things. And she's quoted, one of her quotes is, many still think that women's work should be inside, and it's a problem sometimes to satisfy everyone, even though I may be qualified for the work in the field. So she was out there, she was doing all sorts of duties. She was doing wintertime patrols, all of that. And so there is a quote from the Christian Science Monitor, which describes Margaret in her uniform, and they said, "Picture a tall, clear-eyed, boyish-bobbed, slender young woman, trim in her well-fitting olive green uniform, with its shiny silver badge denoting that she is a member of the Department of Interior National Park Service, immaculate in her high-necked white blouse and black tie, ranger-like in her highly polished leather boots. It is no wonder that at first she was indistinguishable from the other 34 rangers." And so these early rangers we've talked about, they are doing the work of regular rangers, they're filling in, and as this article mentioned, they're indistinguishable. Like in that first photo, we could really barely tell that it was her and not someone else. And so these early ladies are truly just doing the work that everyone else was. And then here's another photo of her, and I think this is like my favorite ever photo of anyone taken ever, because she is like, look how cool she is. She's got her little boots, she's got her book in her pocket, she's got a little handkerchief. She's probably like packing to go out in the backcountry for a couple days. And so I have two stories. I have two stories about her that I'll share in addition. So the superintendent at Yellowstone, and we'll get into him a little bit in a second. So he notes that he this is a quote, only had one experience with a girl ranger that caused trouble, and that was related to Margaret. As a permanent ranger in 1928, she tamed a large gopher snake and brought it into the information office with her, much to the horror of 4 visitors who came into the building. In response, they sent a 200-word telegram to the Secretary of the Interior about the way Yellowstone is being run. He says this is the only instance in which he had to correct a girl ranger's activity. She's just out doing her thing and freaking out early travelers. And then, as she's working there, she got a couple nicknames like Geyser Peg and Paint Pot Peg. And I don't really know exactly where all those came from, but there's another story that makes me chuckle. So she was on a 3-week-long horseback journey with visitors. And now when people go to national parks today, sometimes they'll go on a ranger-led activity, maybe a guided hike or something. But back in the day, when you went to a national park, a lot of times it was more of a guided trip through. Because tourism isn't what it's like today. You can't just rent a car, drive into Yosemite, check in at the gate, and then read some signs, go on your way. This was very much I'm here with you for 3 weeks. We'll take you through it. Here's lodging. We'll feed you. So it was a lot more of a different experience. And so she's out with a group of visitors on a 3-week-long horseback tour, and she's leading a group of visitors through a thermal area. And has anyone been to Yellowstone before? Some of you have. Very cool. So tons of geysers, mud, boiling mud everywhere. The kind of that first layer sometimes can be really thin. And so she, at one point, she falls through the crust into boiling mud up to her knee. And she got second and third degree burns up to her knee, and she utilizes that as a moment to educate the visitors about thermal activity. And so it's just a classic. So anyway, so again, my favorite photo of all time, probably right here. And so we don't really see her in any kind of distinguishable uniform here. Again, probably because she was going out into the backcountry. She was dressed as practically as she could be. And so because there was no standard for women for uniforms, a lot of women kind of, there's a little bit of change with some of them. So these two ladies, the two photos here are of Enid, I think that's how you would pronounce her name, Enid? Enid, okay, thank you. And then Ava on the right. And so she worked for Yosemite for, I believe, 20 seasons. She worked from the 20s into the 40s. And you can see she's got her little badge, but she's, you know, she doesn't have any of that dark, heavy wool on, maybe because it was warm. But again, there was no standard. A uniform didn't exist for women. And we'll talk about that too in a little bit. And then Ava on the right, she's there with her husband Charles, who is also a park ranger. She worked in Yosemite as well for 2 seasons in the 20s.
She's got it good.
The caption on that photo is that she was at their entrance station posing for the photo like it's highway robbery. I don't know if it's in relation to an entrance fee or what, but she's playing around. That's his gun. But you see, she's got her little badge, but she's got it on this like, I don't know what pattern, gingham. I don't know what thank you. So there was a lot of variation in what women could wear. Also, Enid on the top there, that's her. It's hard to see in the photo. She's got a little snake wrapped around her arm. No detail I didn't notice at first, and then I saw the caption. I was like, alrighty. And so relating to uniforms again is Frida Nelson. Again, how cool is she? She's just hanging out. She's got little suspenders, keeping her trousers up. And Frida also worked at Yellowstone. She worked with Margaret and a lot of the others. She was there 1925 to 26. And so she, in all the photos we have of her, she's in the middle. It's kind of that standard kind of women's cut coat with the riding breeches and boots that is fairly standard for women to be wearing. To her left, on the right side there, is the Yellowstone superintendent, which I mentioned a little bit. And I want to go into a little bit of detail about him. His name is Horace Albright, and he is a big name in Park Service history and lore. And for good reason. He worked with another gentleman named Stephen Mather to help create the Park Service itself. And then he served as a director of the Park Service, 1917 to 1919. From there, he went to be the superintendent at Yellowstone and was also the field director of the Park Service. I don't think we really have a position like that anymore. But he was superintendent of Yellowstone from 1919 to 1929. So he was there for about 10 years. After that, he's the director again for about 5 years. So he is instrumental in creating the Park Service. Yellowstone was really seen both by his doing, but by other parks as kind of the blueprint national park. A lot of parks followed what Yellowstone was doing. And so, you know, we talked, you had a great question earlier, like, was it because he didn't mind women working for them, or was it out of convenience? And so that's kind of a interesting discussion, because it's kind of unclear. And I'll kind of say some of his quotes, and we can kind of ponder it, because I've been pondering it for quite a while now. So the general understanding of women in the Park Service in the 20s wasn't negative. You know, media was picking up some stories, and it was kind of gaining ground. But the Park Service itself and Department of the Interior began to put in place limitations in the 20s. And he has some opinions on them, both for and against, that are kind of contradictory in ways. So in 1926, the Secretary of the Interior sends 2 inspectors to Yellowstone. They're kind of doing a department-wide, they're collecting data, they're doing surveys, all that. So he sends 2 inspectors to Yellowstone, and their report, this is a quote, included a recommendation against hiring women as rangers and expressed the belief that women were not physically suited to the arduous duties of a ranger and that the service, which is already undermanned, suffers by the loss of what a qualified man in her place could perform. And which is pretty spitting, but I think it's interesting to define ranger in this sense, because, like I said early on, everyone was a ranger. You know, they're doing the ranger duties. It's a pretty wide breadth of duties, and so the way I analyze that quote is that they were fine with women working for them, but didn't want them considered rangers. And so we'll see after 1926, next to their job title, it'll be ranger, and then in parentheses, naturalist, or ranger checker, which would have been someone at the entrance gate, checking tickets and permits. And so it's not necessarily that they're trying to get them out of the Park Service, but they're trying to, in their view, maintain this image of what a ranger looks like. And to them, a ranger in the backcountry is a man. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And so after that statement from the Department of the Interior guys, Horace Albright says, there are no women rangers in Yellowstone Park doing ranger work. But at that point, he was employing 5 women, and 3 of them were doing ranger work. And we saw Frances, Frida, and Margaret. And so they're all doing the exact same duties. And so if we go by their judgment of what a ranger is, because a lot of women were, at this point we had some women who were clerks, doing kind of our office tasks, and they also kind of put education programs in that category as well. And so, but then it gets, so if he's saying, well, I don't have any women rangers, so he's disqualifying the women who are working by their definition as rangers, and also the other women who are doing other things. But we also have men doing those education programs that he doesn't count as ranger work. So we don't really know what he's talking about. Whether it's the way, when I first read it, my first thought was he doesn't want attention brought to the ladies who are doing the job well and fine. So if he's like, there's no one doing that, don't worry about it, they can just keep on doing what they're doing. That's the way I kind of analyze it. But again, he kind of goes back and forth. Because we saw with Frances, she had the most notable arrest of the year. And so obviously she's arresting people. She carried a sidearm, which falls into all those ranger duties that he was pronouncing that women could not do. So it's really interesting, and I think there's a lot of ways you can kind of take some of these quotes, so I don't want to hang on to it too much. But the way I understand and why he hired so many women is that there were qualified women who could do the job, who lived in the area, and they occurred to him as they were doing their job that they were qualified. He wasn't going out of his way to hire women, nor was he necessarily defending them publicly with the Department of the Interior. So I think, again, it's kind of this middle ground. He also says, and this quote makes me chuckle, because again, he's saying women would be good in XYZ roles, right? And so he's saying that there's naturalist duties and clerical duties that he said women are good at, and he said men are uninterested and, quote, more or less useless in. Which is also a kind of a jab as well on the other end. But then he later begrudgingly acknowledges that, quote, if we are going to keep our organization in the highest efficiency, we may have to employ a few women. So he's really just kind of all over the board.
Sounds like he doesn't really care, and people are trying to pin him down, and he's just like rolling with it. That's how I interpret it.
Yeah, when he was stating, I don't have any women park rangers when the department's kind of getting on him. I initially read that as he's just letting them do their thing because they were doing it well, but there's kind of a lot of discussion in his character, and I think it's just interesting also to put ourselves back into the 1920s too. Like, this is very different from our viewpoint today. And so also for scale, 1926, this is when all this stuff's happening, Yellowstone had 29 permanent rangers and 54 temporary ones. And of those, what is that? 83 total, 5 were women. 1 was permanent, 4 were temporary in 1926. So again, the highest of any park. So he's an interesting character, but as a Park Service person, he was very influential in a lot of things. And I know he gave these women a lot of great opportunities. And so kind of that big difference we see from 1926 is delegating who's a ranger and then specifying are they a ranger naturalist, which is someone who's doing those guided hikes, things like that. Ranger clerks, museum helpers. So they start to distinguish different positions. And so also at Yellowstone, this is later, she's employed in 1929, so this is after kind of that whole discussion gets going with the Department of the Interior. In all records, her job title is Ranger Naturalist. And so she works there for 3 seasons, and so that's her second from the left with the Ranger Corps, as it were. So I think she's a great example of she's still doing the stuff, and her title is just a little different. And you can see that carriage that would have brought visitors into the park, much different from today. And so as we keep going in time into the 30s, we still don't have a specified women's uniform. There are some guidelines that were put in place from different parks. This is Carlsbad Caverns from 1939. And so, we talked a lot about Yellowstone and Yosemite, but caves were employing a lot of women ratio-wise, because caves, their primary thing is guided tours caves, and women had proven at that point that they were capable and good at doing that. And so there's 4 women here. They're kind of right there and then there as well. We start to see, we're getting closer to World War II, so we start to see an influence, because Park Service, before the Park Service was created, some national parks were run by the Department of Defense with the Army, and so a lot of traditions and uniform kind of come from that. And so as we get nearer to World War II, we'll also see what's happening with women's military, the start of that, with these Park Service uniforms as well. So women were wearing, they call it the overseas cap. It's like the little triangle thing. I don't know what the actual term for it is, if that makes sense. But we see them with their skirts, same type of dress jacket. And then this next photo, also from Carlsbad Caverns. We don't know who any of these women are. We don't have their names, which is kind of sad. But some of them are wearing their breeches, some of them are wearing skirts. So the skirt was approved by the Park Service for women to wear, but you can still see there's some variations. And I would love to go on a little cave tour with them. I think that would be lovely. And so this photo is from 1941 at Mesa Verde. So you don't see them wearing their heavy overcoats, because as it is hot out there. But same thing, women are still wearing nearly the same thing. You got that little longer skirt, same tie, same shirt as before. And so as we go through time, we start to see a lot of changes. Oops, wrong way, sorry. Start to see a lot of changes. And so through the 50s, not much change, but when the 60s happen, a lot starts to change. So the women's uniform is now established. So now there is a separate uniform for women. And so it's this skirt, it's this jacket, not super different, but you can see their little, what do they call them, pillbox hats on the top, and their little name tag and badge. And we also see a sharp divide around this time of women doing primarily clerical work. So the woman on the left, she's working at Carlsbad Caverns, and she's collecting entrance fees, and she was also in charge of all the remits, all of that stuff. And so we see women primarily in those guide roles and in those clerical roles. And this is Gail. She works on the right. She works at Everglades. I don't know what time of year Florida is cool enough to wear that jacket, but good for her. These are more photos of women from the 60s. So you'll see without that coat, it's this like wide collared white blouse. So very different from what the men were wearing, and also this beret style hat. The straw flat hat was a men's uniform item. So it's interesting that when we have the distinction between the men and women's uniform, it now gets drastically different. Because before, when there was no women's uniform, they were given a uniform to wear, they were kind of able to do as they pleased. And so we've got, we don't know her name, but she's at Harper's Ferry, and then that's Miss Gregory in front of the White House. And so also in the 60s, this photo shocked me for 2 reasons. One, I have those same chairs in my office. I was like looking at the photo and I'm looking at the chair. I was like, that's the same chair. But anyways, so these 3 ladies are Park Service employees, and on the right, she is an airline stewardess giving them training about how to act and how to wear their uniform. And so this uniform style was implemented in 1961. The photos from 1966, which gives the impression that this is not a new training that they're learning, this is a regular yearly training. And so, which also goes to show like the duties at which the Park Service thought was important to train airline stewardesses. Also, I don't know how they did those heels. If anyone had a job where you wore heels all day, I could never. I talk about uniforms a lot because uniforms to me represent 2 things. It's how the agency views you as an employee and how the public will view you as an employee. And so these women, if you wanted to know what type of rock you're holding, what kind of rock is this? You're probably not going to go to one of those women, even if they know. You know, it degrades their image as a park ranger because they're now in this cutesy little thing. So from the 60s to the 70s, now this is where things get nuts. 1970. So we go from like this 60s white shirt with little pillbox hat to beige. Now the Park Service began, and this might be the most well-known, some of you might have seen some of these images before. The beige is a lot different from the normal clothes and coloring because they were trying to expand into like other earth tones, supposedly. And so this was the women's uniform from 1970 to 1974.
Well, the hat is more practical.
So
At least it's got a brim.
the hat was still not part of the women's uniform. That was a men's item.
Oh, really? That's a men's hat?
Yes. I believe there was so the uniform, there's a whole ton of mini changes as time goes on. I believe later on they do implement that as a women's hat, but it's much different than the Stetson men wear. There were some variations. So you see, and I will say there's a lot of information out there saying women were wearing mini skirts, go-go boots. There are no mini skirts or go-go boots in this uniform. The skirt is like a skirt, like it's a fake skirt. And supposedly the hem had to be only an inch above the knee. I'm sure some women made it shorter, but and so yeah, so there was the dress coat, there's the dress. The orange smock thing was for wives of park rangers, for like functions. You know, we talked a lot about like military spouses, and there was a lot of similar things with Park Service wives. They had social functions, they had a specific little smock for them to wear. And so this was in a magazine, Park Service interpreter's like guide that went out. Now, if you can't read it, I will read some of these because it's like crazy. So on the top left, is it pronounced culottes? And optional boots combined to make this outfit an aid to outdoor interpretation. Down here, now free to do their jobs completely and effectively, NPS women will no doubt add much to the overall atmosphere of a park in their sand beige, trimmed in white. the far right, talk about women's liberation. The gals who lead hikes can really do justice to their roles as interpreters in their new pants outfit. Woohoo! And this is and that special group, the NPS wives, will have orange aprons for official functions. And if you're wondering, well, what about like the dirty, crummy jobs? They thought of that too. It's a dress. That's the domestician's dress made of beige and top crinkle cotton will lend ease in tackling any task. So they thought of everything. And I apologize my mispronunciation. I don't do fashion much. So when this, that's why I wear this every single day. Makes it easy. So when they unveiled this, they had a fashion show at Independence National Historical Park in 1970.
Where was it?
So Independence National Historical Park, Independence Hall. So the boots, and I don't want to retract my earlier statement, there was a total beige boot part of the uniform. The go-go boot, I guess, is separate and different from that. I don't know specifically. But anywho, so there was a fashion show. This was a whole big ordeal. So we've got women on the National Mall wearing their Class A's. Women were still doing the things they had to do, with the pants. And do they rock it? Absolutely. Do I wish I could wear a dress some days? Maybe. Now, this is the nuttiest thing before I move on. I'll let these beige uniforms go to rest. This one. So, did you notice the pattern on their dresses? The polka dots for the centennial of the Park Service. They said this for the centennial. And so, and I don't know if it's, now that I think about the dates, this is the 70s. It's not centennial of the Park Service. It might be bicentennial of the country.
72, yeah. 76 was the bicentennial for.
Thank you. So they're wearing these polka dotted dress that were like, kind of a one-time thing, like not part of the regular uniform, but still uniform. You can tell she's got this scarf with the arrowhead and the polka dots. Like they always say, don't mix like stripes and dots, but arrowheads and dots, I guess they did. But what's kind of cool in this photo, so we've got the two ladies, but this guy is also a park ranger. And so when they brought out the women's beige, they also made a beige dress code for men. And the tie was green and tan striped as an official uniform too. So it wasn't just the ladies, the men's were having kind of these crazy colored things. 1974, there is a unisex green and gray or raw back for women. And so this is them wearing this newly designed Class A dress pant, or uniform dress.
Is it cotton or polyester?
I don't know.
Because that was the big changeover from cotton to polyester,
They were polyester.
Oh, how miserable.
And anyone have a guess where they are? Context clues? Yeah, they're at the National Capital Region. And so from there we see women in the gray and green again.
What year was this again?
The 74 is when it kind of went to this green and gray back. And since then there's been slight iterations as to like skirts, pants, but in general 74 is when things go back.
76, that's the bicentennial, isn't it?
Yes, so we kind of see this, and what's interesting is that women park rangers kind of started wearing this, and then we went all the way to these like beige dresses, and now we're back. So, yeah, Judith, do you have a question?
No.
All right, and then and I forgot to edit this slide, so this one's a little ugly, but I would love to work on a crew with them. They look like they're having the time of their life.
Yeah.
And so we see women not only like wearing the same thing, but working and doing duties that anybody would do, that they're qualified. All these photos were from the Pacific Northwest in the 80s. And so one of the reasons I wanted to do this specific program about women in the Park Service, because my cousin, she's my dad's cousin, so that's cousin once removed, I think is the appropriate way. She worked for the Park Service. This is cousin Ann, and she's known by me, and she was an early park ranger, and she became superintendent of Kenai Fjords in 1988, 2004. So this is my plug for Cousin Anne, because I think she's a super cool lady, and going through kind of this history, like thinking of her getting to superintendent in 1988 is quite impressive. And I'm kicking myself because she retired, and so she was there in 1988, 2004 as superintendent. When she retired, she invited me and my whole family to come visit her at Kenai Fjords. I was 6 years old, and my parents said no, because, I was too young to travel that far. I'm like, Dad, come on. And then I also want to highlight another lady. Tracy Swartout is the Blue Ridge Parkway superintendent. So she is the big boss, and she is lovely. And she worked at Mount Rainier, all these wonderful places, and she is a lovely superintendent and lovely person too. When I worked out of Blue Ridge's headquarters as an intern, you think, okay, intern, she's doing all the crazy tasks. She sent me an email when I finished up, thanking me for everything I've done. And whenever I see her, she's got so many employees spread so far. Whenever I see her, she's asking me specifically about things that are happening and thanking me for some things that are going on. So we love Tracy, and if you didn't know, she is the superintendent here. And so that's kind of the wrap up that I have. Now, in theory, there are women in this photo, and I cannot tell. But I guess in a way, that's the whole point. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Where were your cousin again? Which park is it?
Kenai Fjords. It's up in Alaska.
Okay.
It's
That's amazing.
yeah, it's
It's in Seward, right outside of Seward.
Was she born there or?
no. She started her Park Service career in Florida at it's about as far as you can get. She did a lot of living history at there's a little historic site, a Spanish explorer site. I'm blanking on the name. But yeah, Kenai Fjords, think like orca whales, like breaching in front of glaciers. Yeah.
Olivia, what's her last name?
Costanza. Although she was married earlier, so if you know her, she might have been by a different name. Any other questions or things you're curious about?
What are some of your goals? This was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I don't know. I love learning, and I love exploring, and I moved to Blue Ridge Parkway 2 years ago, and it's I haven't even turned over a quarter of the stones to even begin to explore this place to its full extent. So I would love to be a supervisor one day. Superintendent, it's a lot of responsibility, so we'll see. But I don't know, I just want to keep learning, and wherever that happens to take me is where it takes me, because any national park is cool to work at. As you can tell, I'm a history buff, but I love the interplay between the natural world and the cultural world and how they interact with each other. Which is why Blue Ridge is so cool, because there's everything here. There's the people, there's the plants, there's this and that. So I don't really have a specific answer, but you got me here, so and I'm grateful.
Did you say at the beginning what your path was?
So I started as an intern in interpretation, which is basically education, at Cape Cod National Seashore, up in Massachusetts by the coast. So I was an intern in college in the summers, and then I worked as a seasonal park ranger in interpretation. I did a couple odds and ends internships. I worked at John Adams' house with their curators, which was so cool. Even if you're not a history person, I was like dusting his books in his bookshelf. And it's like, oh, okay, Olivia, what's the serial number? Open up the book, there's his signature. And it's like, oh my God. But I found I was more interested in the stories that things could tell and how I could tell them to people versus like being in the museum cataloging all day, which is just my personal preference. I worked at Manassas Battlefield, which is a Civil War site in Virginia, writing lesson plans for field trips, which was super cool. But that kind of showed me that, Manassas is a very history-based park, obviously, and it was too much history for me. I need enough interplay, because I have the utmost respect for rangers who work at battlefield parks. They know their stuff. And I went in thinking, oh yeah, I know the Civil War pretty well. I was blown away my first day. So And then from there, I interned at Blue Ridge with the volunteer program, kind of as a volunteer coordinator per se. Not my role, but what I wound up doing, and then came back to interpretation with this job. So I kind of went, it was like intern, seasonal, intern, seasonal, intern, permanent. So it took me a while, but quicker than you know. It's hard being seasonal, and that's, as we saw, a lot of the women are the temporary rangers. A lot of our service positions are seasonal. I kind of had to like move to North Carolina and do here and there to where I am. So, any other questions? Things you're curious about? Yes.
From my perception, I noticed I didn't see an African American until 1974. When did African American women actually start having the opportunity to be rangers?
I don't know specifically when to start, but a lot of the early women, you know, you don't see African American women early on at all. One of the early rangers in the 30s worked at Hawaii volcanoes, and my understanding, you know, she's not African American, but she's probably of indigenous, you know, background if she's working there in the 30s and 40s. So I don't really know specifically, but you don't see it a lot, and ratio-wise, it's still not, today it's not accurate with populations in the United States. I don't know to what extent they were barred versus not given opportunities. I don't know specifically. Well, thank you guys for coming, and I will be back in April, and I will be doing something similar, but kind of talking about the Park Service itself and the creation of public lands that are, you know, kind of for everyone to enjoy, and also specifically about the Blue Ridge Parkway and how it was created and formed and built and planned. So if you want to hear me like ramble about history things again, that's a fun one. Lots of old cool photos, especially if you're familiar with this area with the Parkway. I've got a lot of cool like photos of that. So, well, thank you guys.